Hello everybody, my name is Safi and welcome to Overcoming the Diet Mindset podcast. I am 7 years post-op and a trainee psychotherapist. On this podcast, my aim is to vanish crappy fad dieting and unhelpful thinking, to reclaim our mindset with a little rewiring so we can stop yo-yo dieting and get off the roller coaster for once and for all. Well, hello, Claire. Welcome to Overcoming the Diet Mindset podcast. Thank you so much for being my first guest. I'm really excited to have you. So, Claire, could you introduce yourself? Tell us a bit about yourself and all your amazing experience in this field, please.
Oh, well, thank you very much for having me. So my name is Claire Parks. I'm a counselling psychologist. I qualified in 2015, but I've worked in bariatrics pretty much since, I've worked with people who struggled with their weight since I finished my master's. So I did a voluntary role for a couple of weeks, which actually helped me secure my first proper job. As my parents like to say, they were the age of 26, I got my first proper job after being in academia for so long. It was working with overweight children and for their parents. And I think it was that role. I absolutely loved working with the children, but there was just no psychology input and working with them, there are 8, 9, 10. It was a program that was from 0 to 16 years, but the program for the young people was 8 to 16. And there was, they were describing comfort eating, emotional eating, binge eating, low self-esteem. And I wasn't qualified to work with them, but I really wanted to be able to help them. So it was in that post and working with those people, I started the process of training, my own training. And actually I found a psychologist who I did a master's elective as part when I was working for this program. And I found a psychologist who was working in bariatrics with adults. And I realized I just wanted to do what he was doing. It was perfect. So I harassed him for about a year, got the opportunity to sit in on the clinics, and eventually they were looking for someone. So they wrote a job and very gratefully I got that post. So that was my first, I suppose, step into working with people who were struggling with their weight. So that was a weight management post. That was in 2008. And then I started my training as a psychologist in 2009. And I realised very early into my career that I really just wanted to stay in bariatrics, it wasn't really heard of, I suppose, with my other trainees. They were working in adults or in CAMS or learning disabilities, but by my second year, I trained as a psychologist because I wanted to work with this population, and I was really conscious of making that decision so early, and I wasn't even qualified, but I knew it was the right thing to do. It just felt right. So when I finished my training, I set up my own business almost immediately because I just continued to work in a weight management clinic, so working with people. So it's described as a tier 3, so it's before people have bariatric surgery, and medical weight management, so working with a specialist doctor and dietitian. But having seen so many people who had struggled through weight management, slimming clubs, Weight Watchers, Slimming World, and just hearing how disordered their eating had become, I set up my business Mind Over Mass because I wanted to make psychology accessible and affordable. So I spent 2 years trying to get groups starting in the same way that people go to these weekly diet clinics. I wanted it as a weekly, let's share some psychology, let's work together, because the one thing that I'd love doing as part of my work in the NHS was delivering and developing these groups. And really, when people see that they're not the only one who struggle in the same way, it was an amazing opportunity to facilitate these groups and meet some incredible clients. But I really wanted to replicate that in the community, and I just couldn't. So I struggled on for 2 years. I ran a group for free. I think I got 6 participants, but there was no longevity. It just didn't work. And that's where Mind Over Mass evolved to predominantly working over the internet. So when the pandemic hit, I'd been doing it for years already, seeing people virtually. And actually it really worked so incredibly well, because it was those regular appointments fitting into people's lives that, it was easy for them to carve out, 20-30 minutes to make the appointments with me, and regular appointments. Because the one thing I've definitely known in my experience is when we were trying to help people change their eating behaviour in the NHS and we were just giving them a year's input, it just wasn't enough. And it's really about making sure, if people have had, decades of maladaptive eating behaviours, we really need to make sure that we're giving them ample time and opportunity to change. But the way that I set up my Liver Mass, it didn't need to be, long 50-minute sessions. It was just regular check-ins, and that's how I could make it accessible and affordable, which is what I really wanted to do.
And as somebody's experienced it works so well, especially because I didn't know what I needed when I first found you. And, as you say, there isn't very many specialists when it comes to this work. And I think in the UK, I probably have you're the only person I found so far, I think. There are some in America, and Australia seems to be a bit ahead of us. But I think this is vital, and especially with children. I think early intervention is the key. So you've got such great knowledge, and it's amazing. What I want you to share with us a little bit, it's just about, I think, because the people who listen to this podcast and I hopefully reach are people who possibly have had weight loss abroad, so who've had even less intervention or less psychological support than the NHS. So to that person, what kind of support, why is it important to get psychological support in the first instance? And what can they do to support themselves in finding, resources that they can support themselves with? And how do they also find somebody like you and do that work, whether it's 2 years out, 10 years out, whether they've had regains, they're struggling with all those behaviors returning?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what's always surprised me is when I've worked in NHS, and I haven't worked in that many different bariatric units, three really, is that it's very heavy on dietitians. And you might be, I've worked in isolation for so long, and that's why I've been really grateful to be part of a big network of other psychologists. So it's that real opportunity to work with other people and to hear what's happening across other services. But from my perspective, and the dietitians I work with, I've worked with some incredible dietitians who are incredibly psychologically minded because they have done a lot of external additional training, or the NHS, absolutely, there has been some support there, and there are some great training programs. But at the end of the day, when we think about the way that maybe, a dietitian, a nurse, a psychologist would work in a kind of bariatric service, yes, there's some overlap, but we are still very distinctly different professionals. And when we try to understand about why does someone, emotionally regulate, self-soothe, suppress, they're using food as a way of coping. Yes, absolutely. I have worked with a small percentage of people there are medical complications, or they started on a certain type of drug and they gained, 5 stone in 3 months, or there have been significant medical interventions, as I say, that has had an impact that did cause someone to gain weight. But actually that's very rare. Predominantly we are talking about psychological issues with food. And I would definitely say when we start thinking about binge eating disorder in someone who is significantly overweight, absolutely, it is different. And it is important that we think about different interventions from someone who has binge eating, who maybe has a BMI of 25, 26. The way that someone's weight will absolutely impact their eating disorder. So we really need to, I think, acknowledge the heavy psychological component. And unfortunately, it's still, I'm aware there's still some debate about whether obesity should be viewed as a medical condition or if it's a psychological condition. And I can have to say, I can see the pluses and benefits, the pros and cons for both. But I do think we need to invest more in bariatric services. And when I say bariatric, I'm not talking about bariatric surgery, just those type of services. So in terms of, for those people, I'm very aware that there are so many people who have bariatric surgery or have problems and difficulties with their weight, and they have no support and they didn't know where to access support. And just recently I was doing an assessment with someone who said that they were working in an eating disorder service because they had money. The service had money to treat binge eating, and then suddenly the parameters of the service changed and the money was stopped and their input was suddenly stopped. And unfortunately, within the NHS, eating disorders, yes, there's a lot of money for eating disorders, but actually, is there a lot of money to treat people with binge eating disorder? No, there really isn't. Or they're in the same service as someone maybe who has bulimia. I think we're talking about very distinctly different. Yes, they may come under the same umbrella as an eating disorder, but actually there's some significant differences there. And there isn't enough specialised input. So in terms of where do people get that support, a lot of it is self-reliant. I mean, there are some incredible support groups, WLS Info, there's Ken Clare set up an incredible charity. I think that's one of the biggest.
Obesity UK,
that's why they've changed. Yeah,
I've been doing a bit of work with him actually, so he's incredible.
Oh, fantastic guy. And I think the bariatric community, I mean, there's so much support, and maybe, and I know from the research and from, I suppose, my own clinical experience is, unfortunately, bariatric patients have had to seek this out for themselves. They've had to really, as Ken talks about his own journey, they've had to do it because actually it's been so severely lacking. And I think there definitely seems to be a shift. I know during the pandemic there were lots of webinars, and one of the surgeons presented and talks about basically making the primary procedure the most effective it can be, because unfortunately some people don't do well with their first procedure and they want a second. I've consulted people who want a third, and unfortunately I've seen people who wanted a fourth bariatric procedure. And I think we need to really make sure, let's get it right the first time. And how do we get it right the first time? Well, let's really think about how do we support people. And yes, I think maybe a lot of people view the lead up to their primary procedure, particularly in the NHS, is a tick boxing exercise or jumping through hoops. Does it have to be that protracted? And, the expectation. I think there's a fine balance in terms of how long or what the process is for workup. But ultimately, there's a lot of things we don't know that will happen once someone's had bariatric surgery. And it's really about making sure that there is support available to them if they need it, and at what point in their journey. Why, do they only have support for the first 12 months or for the first 2 years? We talked to them at the beginning about bariatric surgery being a lifelong procedure, but then we only give them, a few months post-op support, and then, oh, well, sorry, you're outside the window now, so you have to find it yourself.
And that's absolutely shocking, because it would have taken somebody before, I think research says it's about 8 years before actually the average person goes to their GP and gets on that journey for bariatric surgery. So from a psychological impact, the trauma that would have, the shame, the constant feeling like you've now failed another diet, there's something you're a flawed human on some level. I think that is really overlooked. And that is the people who are actually getting the gold standard of bariatrics. That's the people who can access the NHS. As you know, some of us can't and don't get any psychological input. I wonder how many people do you think, and I know, this is just possibly a ridiculous question, but how many people do you think have disordered eating before, or have, for example, binge eating disorder? What do you think percentage is, if you're taking a guess, of people that have a binge eating disorder by the time they have bariatric surgery?
I think that's a really great question, because, we can, when we talk about going to the research literature, I think it's anywhere from, like 30% to kind of 90%, these kind of figures are thrown out. But it's interesting when you start to really understand, if we were to take binge eating primarily, and we start to think about what that loss of control is, and just how do we define, I suppose, what normal eating is. I find it really quite fascinating, because, yes, we can talk through what the definition of binge eating is, but when sometimes people will describe a loss of control because they had 2 biscuits, whereas for someone else it's, well, I ate half a packet of biscuits, and it's those elements as you described. Shame. Shame can stop people accessing that input, that, so I would say 99% of people, I would say, have some, I would say, quite significant disordered eating. Although when we often talk about binge eating or emotional eating, or people who have difficulties around the way that they eat, I don't think we talk about it enough. So when I do an assessment with someone and I ask them about their emotional eating, I want to understand how it affects them. So, I'll just explain to you. So when I do an assessment with someone, often we do talk about emotional eating. Are you using food as a way of suppressing or soothing emotions? And sometimes people will be in touch with that, and sometimes they're not aware. Often people will talk about feeling bored and they just eat. But I think it goes deeper in that. And some of the consistent themes that I hear, and that maybe people don't acknowledge enough, is that often people do eat out of a sense that they have no perceived control or lack of confidence or ability that they can lose weight. And actually that seems to me a consistent theme that I hear in my clients describing why they eat. So they might not necessarily talk about there isn't a really specific emotion connected with that. It's just that they just don't believe it'll ever happen for them. So it's just this giving in, well, I might as well have. And when we think about the obesogenic environment and just how much food is constantly available to people, and almost we're bombarded with messages all the time that you need to, you should be eating all the time. So I think that is a really unhelpful thought or message that I think absolutely the dieting industry has a significant, responsibility. They have, I really, when we think about disordered eating, the dieting industry is so accountable. I mean, I've worked with people who they've done that many different diets and they could absolutely tell me the rules to all the different diets, but it's left them feeling so confused about what to eat. And I do recall, it was many years ago, I was doing an eating experiment with them. It was a patient in the NHS. And I'd had my tub of raisins because I always had some dried fruit, and if it ever felt like, let's do an impromptu, let's do an eating experiment. And this poor lady, I can still visualize myself being in the room with her at that moment, and she was just looking at it, and she burst into tears, and she just said, I don't know whether I'm allowed to have this or not. And for me, it was so profound. She was just so confused. And I think when we understand again about why people eat, this idea of, eating a certain way, a certain diet, they're going to follow that day. And then we talk about dietary violations. I've failed, I've ruined it, I've blown it. Or as one of my clients talks about, maybe have breakfast in an Atkins style, and then it will be, I don't know, keto for lunch, and then some kind of low carb, mixing all the different types of diets. But an element of, well, if you basically have anything that's maybe got sugar or carbs and you failed, you've blown it, well, I'll overeat today because I'll restrict again tomorrow. And I think, yes, we can absolutely then talk about, emotions that arise based on that. But actually, again, that's the dieting industry, that perception that you failed something, as opposed to, no, this diet is too restrictive. And presenting the fact that actually, well, everyone else who follows this diet, it works. It must be you. There must be something categorically wrong with you. Then you can't follow this diet. Not that actually there's something inherently wrong with the way that this diet is that you're supposed to be following. I feel like I've kind of got on a tangent. I can't even remember.
No, it's brilliant, because I think what I've learned recently, doing loads of reading for the podcast, is that actually there's so much biology at play, and nobody 100% understands why, processed food, why some people store it the way they do. And we've solved a problem by, in the West, we no longer struggle with famines and food insecurities, but then we've got we've gone the other way, with the biggest space in the supermarket being taken up by processed food. But nobody really knows on a metabolic rate what happens, to why some people store weight the way they do, and then there's set points, and it's so complicated. And for somebody who's really interested in trying to understand it, I'm finding it really difficult to digest the information. But for somebody who just wants to lose some weight or just had weight loss surgery, it's a minefield. And I spend a lot of time on Instagram and social media, and that the constant emphasis on protein, and carbs are the devil, and it's huge in the community. People will do story after story on Instagram, almost like they're in church, just telling us, repenting and sharing their, how much carbohydrates they've had and how they need to. So it's almost moved away from that, that green and red plan, for example, from Slimmer World, to now we've almost just brought that along with us to the bariatric. So it's just really hard, because that mentality is so deep rooted. It's so deep rooted, and ultimately there's people that are making a lot of money from the pain and the fact that we're going to be basically customers for life,
Absolutely. That's what they want, don't they? Essentially, for you to feel that as the customer, you failed, and that the plan does work, and actually we'll just come back again. And I did volunteer. Oh God, this was before I had my kids. I was really interested, and I did 3 months voluntary, just wanted to go to Weight Watchers and just go and see what it looked like. And I was really keen also to hear what they were talking about with their clients, and actually how much were they were talking about understanding about why they ate rather than just, stick to the plan. And yeah, I would witness, I particularly remember this lady coming back, and the counsellor or the leader was talking about, oh, you're back again. And she's like, yeah, I put all the weight back on again. She's come back again. I don't know how many times she's come back to this program, and this weight cycling that so many people will describe. And I think, when I think about my experience, one of the reasons why I absolutely love working in this area is because my background before I trained as a psychologist was in nutrition and physical activity. So my first degree was in sport and psychology, and then I did a master's in sports psychology, but really interested in sustainable activity, really. And I was thinking about moving into kind of policy writing and how we could get people to be more active. But as I say, this first post just drew me into that area. So I've got a very strong background in nutrition and activity. And I think when we start to unpick about why weight is so complicated, if the diets worked and it was that simple, then it wouldn't be this, £1 billion industry. But essentially, I've read a lot more around gut health, and I think it's fascinating, the explosion in research in that area. When I talk to people about why they might struggle with their weight, in their health, really thinking about what else is going on in their life. Yes, obviously understanding about what they're eating, but when we think about hydration, sleep, and stress, and I think we've really underplayed the impact that all those three factors have. And I know the research we can point to, children who have TVs in their bedrooms are more likely to struggle with their weight. Well, is that because they're sleep deprived? Is that, sometimes they talk about the impact of the light, the benefits of sleeping and rest, what happens to your blood sugar levels overnight. If people have TVs in the room, are they more likely to eat later in the evening, which we know has an impact. So there's obviously lots of studies that show correlation between certain factors. When we start to unpick about stress and inflammation and metabolic syndrome and cortisol, and then all this research now into gut health, time-restricted eating, I'm really fascinated. And it's really interesting if you start unpicking the research around fizzy drinks. There's no way I'll ever let my kids, I've told them they can have it when they're 18, once they leave the house. But to me, giving my kids fizzy drinks is like giving them cocaine or ecstasy, with everything that I've read and the damage it does to your gut microbiome.
Yeah, no, fizzy drinks is it's my drug of choice, and it's one that I'm going to be working on for a long time.
Highly addictive, highly addictive. But do we tell people that? Is that written all over the labels about how highly addictive it is, and the experience that you can have physically from the withdrawal symptoms for those people who do consume a lot? What does that say about it? But we don't have anything. Because food manufacturers and companies, they create too much money. When you start looking at kind of the dark side of things, some of these things, it's understandable. You can understand why they don't have anything printed on the cans about how addictive and dangerous it is. And we might get the odd story about, someone died because they drank 7 cans of something, but we generally don't talk about those things. It's diet, it's got no calories, and it's fine. Well, if calories in and calories out was the only factor, then people would lose weight and they would maintain that weight loss. It's far more complicated than that.
Society, I think popular media and even the medical community have bought into now that narrative, and it's something that's deep. It's so deep rooted in our culture that, on one hand, we are giving you all this processed food that nobody really knows the impact, almost like cigarettes.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the other hand, we're going to, shame you into every illness that you go to see your GP about. It's about your weight. I was actually working with somebody, and she said to me, she's got depression, but the doctor won't give her antidepressants because he wants her to lose weight. And so stories like that, I think it's just I don't know, I think it's going to be a big battle. It's going to be a long journey, but I want people to, one thing I want the people who are experiencing it just to be kinder and realize there's so many things at play. It's not all down to you. It's not personal choice. It's not, and I think that's what my biggest, if I, do any work in this field for the rest of my life, I want it to be about kindness and compassion understanding that this is not your fault. Nobody decides that they're going to do this to themselves. It's so, yeah, no, I definitely, they're very powerful, the food lobby. I think even the sugar tax was very, very difficult to implement. So, no, I definitely understand that. I think it would be really good to have some kind of takeaways that maybe somebody who just come out of weight loss surgery, maybe 2 years out, can kind of implement. And I remember when you first said to me about self-care, and it seems so simple, and this group of people that's so used to wanting things to be hard. The harder the diet, the more success you're gonna have. Work hard. That's why I guess a lot of people feel stigma around saying they've had weight loss surgery, because deep down they feel that they have cheated. So self-care for some of us is almost alien, because we think, well, you have to be in the gym and punish and gym exercise and not doing enough, not good enough. So I just would like you to talk to that person, a bit like me when we first met, who is overwhelmed and just really in a place of fear, and I guess living in that part of the brain that just wants to scream. What small steps can we take to I guess to even just calm that part of our brain down?
I think it's a really good question, and it's a really good point that I would say, yeah, a lot of people that I've worked with have had really poor self-care. And for some people, when we think about our own values, things that are important to us, I would say that a lot of people that I've worked with are natural carers. They are naturally someone who maybe is very empathic and really values looking after others. It's really important to them. But unfortunately, it does mean that they maybe they're much lower down in the pecking order, or however, so their capacity for self-care is diminished. Absolutely, I would say that sometimes there's life events that make it much harder for them to be able to prioritize themselves. And I don't think it helps that, particularly if we think about what's going on currently with the cost of living crisis and the hours that people have to work. I mean, I think it's horrifying that we're hearing stories that people who work full time are having to visit food banks. I mean, I don't know how that is possible in this day and age that people can be experiencing that. But, if we just imagine the levels of stress and pressure that people may be under. So, it's very easy sometimes. And I think as, mental health professionals, particularly, trying to talk to someone about boundaries and self-care, sometimes life is just too overwhelming for them to maybe just carve out some time for themselves. And I know this is why, when we do think about bariatric surgery, sometimes it's not about saying yes or no, it's about really thinking about the best time for surgery. I have worked with people who maybe didn't realise just how much they lack that, not just time, but that emotional capacity to be able to focus on them. And actually by having surgery, it really forced them to make some quite significant changes after the operation. I mean, literally forced them. Maybe they had to, relationships changed, or work environments had to change, reduction in hours, changing jobs, because they made that choice and they really wanted the surgery to really be successful, but they really recognised that they couldn't continue, they couldn't self-care in the way that they needed to post-surgery. I mean, I would say that's quite extreme, and I think that's where, I suppose, the work up to surgery, it's never about, it frustrates me when these bariatric services still think about, someone's got to demonstrate that they're capable of losing weight and only then can we put them forward for surgery. It should never be about that. It's about actually understanding about why they've maybe struggled with their weight for so long, and understanding how to prioritise themselves more, thinking about boundaries, understanding, I don't know if they've got internalised stigma when we think about, often people will use the terms lazy, greedy, because that's what they hear in the media, and they maybe tell those stories about themselves now, and making those shifts and changes. Because as I say, if it doesn't happen before surgery, sometimes it does feel it has to be really enforced post-op, or they do get suboptimal weight loss, or they really absolutely do struggle in the, months, years, maybe after surgery. So I suppose if I was trying to talk to anyone about thinking about self-care, I think, again, probably, I'd say very biased, I wouldn't say you necessarily have to really work with someone who is a specialist in bariatrics. If someone is struggling with prioritising themselves, working with any mental health professional, just to get them to really understand and know themselves more. There are, if you think about kind of counsellors, someone who's just started their training, you could be paying, maybe £10-15 an hour, up to maybe, obviously, anywhere, I suppose, up to about £100 an hour for a qualified counsellor. If that feels too out of reach, that process of kind of journaling, that can be incredibly introspective and really trying to, learn more about yourself. I think sometimes we can be very dichotomous and very black and white in trying to maybe problem solve. I don't know if we were thinking about the idea of trying to problem solve low mood, just be happier, just must change these things. We're not talking about trying to problem solve your bariatric surgery in the sense of, must carve out more time or yes, we can talk about it from a very pragmatic level, but for someone who struggled with a weight for decades, you're not going to just be able to problem solve this situation. It will go much, much deeper than that, and really needing to know who you are, that kind of core person. So this is where it's about, if you can, really investing in yourself. But actually, if that's something that you've never done, it's going to be really hard for the idea for you to reach out and to try and find a professional. And I think that's why I get the sense of almost people come to me when they're just so desperate that something has to change. And I find that it's really sad and shocking, really, that we don't offer more support. We've got so much more support for maybe, addiction services. And I'm definitely not labelling. I wouldn't say that everyone, that when we think about addiction, food addiction, I don't think it, in my opinion, it doesn't map the same way. But I would absolutely say that there are some elements some elements that cross over. But essentially what I am saying is that we just don't have the resources. We aren't putting the resources in. So I don't know, I'm really conscious of this not sounding really negative, because I think it's really hard. I suppose it's for someone to really be able to say, I'd hope that they'd be maybe listening to this podcast, or they're recognising that actually they need some help. And maybe there is more of this theme around self-care, that might enable someone to shift something to actually say that I need help. But often there is so much shame that holds people back. And unfortunately, I've seen it in the NHS, shame stops people. They're really grateful for this bariatric procedure, absolutely really grateful that the NHS have paid for it as well. But that shame in feeling like they're failing again, I'm failing surgery now, I've failed everything else, I've had surgery and I'm failing that, because maybe they didn't make the changes because they weren't supported enough, because, I think we all know how dire the NHS is at the moment, and that the services are trying to do the best job that they can, but it's like doing surgery with one hand behind your back, isn't it? It's just, I think it just feels, it's so hard. So yeah, I
hear that, Claire. I definitely do. And I think it's about, I think there's a point, there's a time where you realize that the surgery, because before the surgery, and that's why I think assessments before surgery, we're going to say whatever we have to say to get that surgery.
Absolutely.
And I would too, but there's going to be a window where I think one realizes there's something else deeper than this. There's a piece missing. And when you realize that, and now with social media, with all its downsides, there's so much more information that you can access, with a lot of therapists making all sorts of information available now. But you could go to your GP and even get some talking therapy through IAP. There are charities that also do discounted therapy. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, I'll always recommend that you go and see and find somebody that specializes in this field, because it's so, I always think one size fits nobody. Mm. So, I think as much as you can to find somebody that's tailored, understands this field, will be really, really helpful. And I 100% recommend that. But in such a, finances and this resources, I know everybody's always thinking about that. But Claire, if we wanted to work with you, where would we find you? What kind, are you taking clients? How could we connect with you?
So yeah, no, I am taking clients, and my website is mindovermass.co.uk. So I'd always recommend, it's got my number on there and email. So yeah, I definitely, there are some really great services out there, and I know that they've employed more in IAPT, and I think it is about trying to connect with someone. And I absolutely agree. I think Having specialist input can be really important, but unfortunately I don't think there are many bariatric psychologists, or certainly we're in quite in demand. I'm not on social media. I can't stand social media. And I remember when I first set up Mind Over Mass, I had an incredible marketing lady, and she was telling me, tell more about who I am and get myself out there. And I think as psychologists, we're told, boundaries, don't over-disclose, don't self-disclose. And I think it is really important, when we're thinking about that therapeutic work, I will occasionally use self-disclosure, but only if it feels like it will benefit my clients. And I was very aware early on, because I didn't go down that route, that maybe it took longer for my practice to be more established. But I am very happy with the decision that I made, because I know sometimes maybe people might find it quite hard to find me. But I suppose I'm also aware of not, it is just me. It's a one-man band. I know other professionals who maybe have gone into this area are happier maybe having more people and more group support. And I think in an ideal world, I would love, I miss running my groups so much. I was gutted when I had to leave the NHS during COVID, because the demand was just so great. And I was completely overwhelmed and swamped. But I would love to run some groups. And if there's need out there in the West Midlands and I can get people, I would absolutely want to offer more, because I am aware that, particularly when I think about bariatric tourism, I know a lot of people are maybe going off to Turkey because they feel like they can't get the waiting lists have gone crazy in the NHS, and the wait is so long. But yeah, I suppose it's about people who are maybe really struggling with their own self-care, but essentially you have to have that fight, or if you've got a loved one who can really do the fight for you. So I suppose it's about then you opening up to someone who can fight your corner with you.
Definitely. And I think, every day we look at the newspaper or news or whatever, wherever you get your news from, and obesity is not getting any better. It's just going to be something that escalates, sadly. And at the rate it's going, and the services are not growing with it. So, this is just going to continue to grow, and that psychological support is going to be vital. And whether you train other therapists, and, there's going to be, I'll be one of them. I think there's going to be people who would need that training and that specialism from people like yourself to get that accreditation, to get that to support. So, there are a lot of other ways that you could, share that, moving on, share that information, knowledge. So people like me as counsellors can specialise in bariatric surgery, and then I guess we can build the community and the professional community that way. But yeah, well, thank you so much, Claire. It's been amazing to have you, and I will have your website link under the show information bit. I haven't worked out all the lingo yet of podcasting, but I feel really, really grateful that you were my first guest, and I'm delighted to have you, and I'm glad you're out there doing the work. And thank you so much.
No, thank you for having me.
I appreciate you for being here with me. I hope you got some value from this episode. If so, please give me a review. It will make me super happy and support others from our community to find the podcast. Share it with your Barry bestie. Connect with me on Instagram at Gastric Mindset. It'll be wonderful to hear from you.